Welcome to the third presentation where we take our normal look into the data, and this time we'll be looking at some of the income and expenditure data in GTAP as well as some of the parameters. Okay, let's think about our regional household construction in this model. So certainly the case that we could think about different agents and given them a less tied together behavioral pattern, and we'll continue to come back to this when we get to the second phase of the course, but it is useful to think about here that at the top level, why do we do this, or why is it important, or what is the advantage? And it's really this idea that you get this regional agent, utility maximizing regional agent that collects the regional income and decides how to spend it. And it means if you have that utility argument at the top level for the entire region, that means you can do a welfare calculation. So you could do something like equivalent variation and identify what the income equivalent of being at some other utility level versus the one you are. That is the goal, because a primary use of global CGE policy models is to compare national welfare outcomes under alternative policy approaches. And so having that sort of consistent top level regional utility measure gives us that EV, or that money metric version of the welfare, and it gives us some other advantages too, because you'll learn later that we've gone far and above the idea of a regional regional equivalent variation, and broken it out into all these contributions to regional welfare. So you can understand policy shock by policy shock, commodity by commodity, how the change in the money metric welfare measure is coming about. That is the reason that we have it set up this way. So what does it cost us? Well, if you're on the public expenditure side and thinking about revenue collection via taxes and public expenditures, whether they be through subsidization or public good purchase procurement, then you don't have that explicit link. Remember, the taxes are all collected by the regional household. The regional household solves this sort of utility maximization problem, or if you prefer, expenditure minimization problem, with that top level utility nest. And so we don't have that linkage in choice and budget collection, because income can go up and the regional household will proportionally allocate more to government. So that could be a high cost in some cases, and of course we have methods for turning that off and fixing that. That's what I was just talking about with those DP variables. The DP gov variable would let you fix government spending even though you have some set of shocks that are driving up regional income, and so you force that money to be distributed over savings and private purchases, not flowing over to the government side. Worth noting, the global data coverage is just not where it needs to be for us to try to implement some connecting mechanisms between revenue collection from taxes, subsidies being spent, and the public expenditure pattern. So even if we wanted to build it, we would only be of limited use for a few regions, because the data would be pretty circumspect for most places in the world. I mentioned the welfare module. It is down in section 11, 3400 in the code. Okay, we're going to start our examination of the data by looking for income in the code. And so we're going to use the search argument of income. You'll find that the word income shows up in GTAP a lot, as you might expect. The variable we're going to go for is this coefficient, which reads in the original or the base level income, private, government, and savings. And then we'll use our gloss tools to move around the code and look at some other things, as well as open run GTAP. I'm going to open run GTAP, and we'll start from there and pull out into the code and work our way from the code to the data. Okay, I have opened run GTAP. You should too. Go to your version tab and see what version you have. It should be NCORS 3x3. That is again the version 7 of the GTAP model, and it's dates back to an old version of the database, but a lot of the teaching materials that we use were written on that version for the database. And again, we're learning the mechanics and the analysis points, the analysis paths through GTAP, not trying to get the latest data here. More time for that later in the course. So we said we were going to open the code, so that's the next thing I will do, and then we're going to search for the income coefficient. Okay, I'm going to click on View, Tab Files, Main Model. Go ahead and do that. Now we'll go to Search, Find, and I'm going to type income, open parentheses, R, and see what I get. Okay, so it takes me down here to, you see I get the blue one, which is the current cursor location, and then these R shaded ones are other versions of income, open parentheses, /R. So it says it's the level of expenditure which equals net income in region R, and then down here we see that there are three components: private expenditure, government expenditure, and savings, which comprise income. So we can't go read income. This is a formula, this is a coefficient. We can't go read income from the database anywhere. We would have to calculate it using these components, or if these components are maybe not even be in the database. And so that's where we're going to gloss and work forward from. Okay, in order to navigate, what I do is in this income equation, I'm going to put my cursor inside of the private expenditure coefficient. Remember, these three add up to make income. Click on gloss. It'll open up for me this set of lines in the model code that refer to PRIVEXP for each region. So private expenditure R. And if we look here, we see the formula. So here's the coefficient introducing it. We can go up to that here. And so we have the coefficient being declared, and now here we have the formula which is defining it. So we have a new coefficient. So we're tracking our way to try to find some data pieces that we could go look at. And so we have VPP here, which is indexed over commodity and R. So it is private expenditure, just is the version of VPP that is summed up over commodities. So we could gloss again. Click on gloss, and we would now see here's VPP. So it's a coefficient, VPP, private household expenditure on commodity C in region R at producer prices. If we read down through here, we see a formula that says add up VDPP, VMPP, okay, which are also commodity region indexed. Now we may be somewhere. Let's click on 693, move up here, and now we can go track our way track backwards one more time for VDPP and see if that gets us to a piece of data that is read in from outside the model. All of this so far has just been formulas built up from different components of the data. place my cursor in VDPP, gloss, and you see here we have it, a coefficient that is red. I'm going to click on line 436 over here in the red for the quick navigation, and I have what I want. So we are coefficient VDPP, read, update. Okay, so it's being read from the GTAP data file and at the header VDPP. And then here's the update statement that says when this needs to be updated in the nonlinear solution method, take this price percentage change from the model, this quantity percentage change from the model, use those to update this. Okay, before we leave the code, I want to search one more term, and that is the consumption shares, or CO con share. So let's go to search, find. You see that I have highlighted text, so it expects that I want to search for that, but I'm not. I'm going to search for CONSHR, open parentheses, and I'm going to click on search forward from top. Close. And so if we had looked at the gloss a little more for VPP, we would see that those consumption shares that that were so prevalent in the elasticity so prevalent in the calculation of the elasticities, all those formulas for the CDE is actually calculated here. It's the ratio of private spending on a particular commodity to the total for private expenditure. So while we're here working our way through VD, PP, and private expenditure and the consumption shares, I just want to make note of where we are in the code. You see right here, this is giving us sort of a heading of what is being done in this section. Remember, these are comments. It says this is the elasticity of cost with respect to utility from private consumption. And so our consumption share, this thing that we've been interested in and we know to be the share of an expenditure at this second level for the private household, is being read in, or is being calculated very early in the code, line 846, and in a section devoted to this utility elasticity. And so here you see the ink par being read in. And in fact, all of this is being done before you get to the main equations of the model. And so we have what we call these sort of global variables, not global to the global, like the world, like geography, but global. They sort of sit outside the proper equation system because they get used in several different modules. And so we declare and set up any number of things as sort of overture to the actual models, and consumption share is one of those shares that you sort of expect to originate somewhere else, but it is up here at the top. Okay, we were on our way to look for VDPP, so we'll go now and do that. I'm again in Run GTAP. I'm going to click on View, Base Data, the Core Data, and ViewHAR opens. It goes and it picks up the base data that lives in the in-course 3x3 folder, and we see down here at 12, VDPP, domestic purchases by households at producer prices. So it's a commodity and region indexed measure. It is domestic version of this, and so if we look through here, we see that we're actually in a section that is all about purchases. Domestic purchases, that line is repeated here repeatedly. So 8 and 9, those headers we covered last week, those are firm purchases. Again, an important part of demand, but not part of the final demand. Those are intermediate. But here we have the government coefficients, VDGP, VDGB, and then the private. Here's the investment goods. Okay, and then you even have the primary factor, and then you get imported purchases by firms, and if you move down you'll see import purchases by government, import purchases private. We would find all of that down below in 17 on. But we found what we were looking for here. Okay, so we could use this. We could calculate some con shares right here, right? If we use one of the share calculators to take a column share, and we get the con shares for every region. Sorry, these would not be the true con shares. These would be the domestic version. So since we are only looking over the domestic data in this model, these would be the con shares if we zeroed away the trade. But the concept is the same, right? So VPP would have both domestic and import in it, and you would take something like a column share, so commodity over the total. And then, if just to remind you, this selector up here lets you use InViewHar, no shares, so you're getting the level form. A row share, you're getting a share or a comparison of, I guess this would be global food measured in VDPP terms, right? So you always have to remember what context you're in. And so it's really just a size of these places relative to one another. But maybe something else. Column, so this would be measured. This would be the traditional way to look at this, the share comparison within a region. Food is 37 or 38%, 20% manufacturers, 43% on services, compared to something like the EU, much lower share on food, slightly lower on manufacturers, much larger on services. Sort of what we expect. There's also a matrix share. That sets the entire matrix to 1. And so every cell in here, I don't know what you use that for, but that is also there. Let's turn that off and let's get back into our slides a little bit. Okay, if you're reading through the slides separately from watching this, you may need to advance a few. I talked about several of the notes as I went. But I do want to sort of highlight that line 10 through 15 where we saw the government, private, and investment, and remind us that we can read past the domestic purchases here and we see households purchases at producer prices, household purchases at basic prices. So these coefficients where we see B versus P in the coefficient name, that is just telling us whether we're looking at producer prices or basic prices. And the difference between the two, between 1629, etc., 157, etc., is going to be the taxation that occurs in that transaction. So as we go from producer to basic or producer to market valuation, what is the taxation that occurs? So we get private, government, investment. You can also see the firms. That logic is always the same, right? So the flow of the payment tells us what transaction we're at, and that tells us what price level. And of course, our next modular topic in Module 4 is on the price system in GTAP. So we'll think about basic prices and producer prices more clearly. Just remind ourselves that there's this other version of the GTAP data called GTAP view data. So it takes the GTAP core data, does some reads of it, reads in these core value flows, and then reformats it through a series of formulas to put it into these aggregates that are more familiar to us. So something like GDP from the expenditure side. And so you see here that header AG01 in the GTAP view version of the data gives us GDP from the expenditure side, and we get sort of what we think about the regional expenditure system being the consumption, investment, and government spending. And so those would match up. And so Remember, these are built from core data items on payments made and used to capture those transactions. And then, of course, the key data for private demands are that consumption share and the parameters. Go back into your Run GTAP, same version, and let's just open up through View the parameters. Okay, so I expand that out, and I see here in the second and third header are SUBP and INCP, that is the subpar and the INCPAR. So we have the substitution parameter in the CDE minimum expenditure function. So it is sort of a dual to the utility function. We solve it as the utility target, what is the minimum expenditure to reach it, and then here's the INCPAR on that other parameter in the same system. So we can open those up and get a look at what these are and see why what these look like. So we have all the commodities on the rows, all the regions in the columns, and looking down we see these declining subpars, sort of a pattern. And then let's go back to get the INCPAR, and you see these increasing INCPARs. Okay, so just want to encourage you to resist the temptation to try to interpret these directly. What I do and what we will do, and when we're interested in a demand side parameter, is we will go into the code and evaluate the elasticity. These are calibrated, these are CDE parameters to a pretty complex implicit utility function, and while they certainly are very, very connected to what we have, they are filtered through the consumption shares in the base data, which have to be to get the point of approximation for that demand system. And so while these are drivers, we also have the true elasticities written right into the demand equation that flow from these CDE parameters. So I copied in the subpar and INCPAR from this aggregation, or this version of the model, and I just thought I would put down the E sub VA just to get a quick comparison. Remember, these totals they're an artifact of ViewHard's operations. It wants to calculate sums at the end of every row and every column just in case you need them for shares. And in a parameter file, we don't need that. So I put the red lines through those just so we could ignore them more easily. But we already tracked down and saw these sort of declining patterns and increasing patterns, and we'll think about what that might mean just briefly here, and then when you get to the advanced topics, why that might be. And then of course we might also think about, is there a way to look across Sub-Saharan Africa, EU, rest of world in terms of their size and maybe their per capita income, and understand a little bit about the differences we see. And that's important, because what we don't want to have happen is every region look the same, because it wouldn't be as good for analysis. And one of the things that is going on in GTAP that we may not have deduced last week is the substitution, the technology in GTAP for production. So something like the substitution between land, labor, and capital, the value-added substitution. In the food sector, it's 0.604, and it doesn't matter which region you're in. So same thing, manufacturing, that is 1.153, so something a little more substitutable, and then even more substitutable between those value-added components when you get to services. But the key is that it's repeated across all regions. So we're making the assumption that substitution possibilities, the technology frontiers, really shape the same no matter where you are in the world. Now that may be an assumption that's too rigid for you, and that one's a fairly easy one to change. You go in, you set up new values for E sub VA, and it's a CES elasticity, so it should work fine. These are not the same across, right? So we could actually understand what these are, and of course we have a lecture later in the advanced topics that is devoted to that, to thinking about this calibration exercise and how we expect the behavior, the responsiveness to change across regions. If we didn't know that, then we wouldn't have a reason to put all the CDE in, and we wouldn't have a reason to say things like empirically we know sort of how this behavior should look as income grows in a region. So we do have this differentiation across regions being driven that isn't in the production side. You can change it here, and if you want to change it here, not so simple. You don't just go in and put a new value in. You could be perturbing a lot of things. So these need to be changed with thought to all the restrictions on demand and the idea that adding up symmetry, homogeneity, all have to be preserved. Okay, because you've been patient with the CDE, I do want to give you some notion of how you might look at these parameters, the INCPAR, the subpar, and think about elasticities. And these are slides I took from Rob McDougall, so just to give you an idea, he will work through this with you later in the course, and he will show you these things to give you sort of the rules of thumb, and then of course some implications for analysis from these. But he looks at sub-Saharan Africa. What is the relationship between INCPAR and elasticity? Well, the higher the INCPAR goes, the higher you expect the income elasticity to be. Okay, so there's no, that is what we're talking about. So as you're moving down a commodity, through the commodity set, the higher you see the INCPAR, the higher the income elasticity will be. It's a little more complicated with the relationship between the price elasticities and subpar. So here we're talking about the absolute value of the compensated price elasticity. As subpar falls, the compensated price elasticity will go up, and the same thing, if the consumption share falls, it will go up. Okay, so that is all in this sort of Slutsky equation view here. So taking the uncompensated price elasticity, so you have the uncompensated is equal to the compensated price elasticity minus the income elasticity times the consumption share. So for a fixed income elasticity, you can see these two effects in play here. So what must happen if this is constant, this changes, well, this must adjust. And of course, if this is changing, this one must adjust. And then the thing that Rob likes to remind people and help them understand, and where we might begin again later in this course when he presents this, a discussion of limitations of the CDE, and while it does a lot of the things we like, why the behavior might be something that anyone really interested in angle effects might want to think about alternatives for, and doing the work to rebuild some demand side stuff. He notes here that the second effect, the income elasticity times the consumption share, is really dominant in this calculation. So the uncompensated is going to be mostly determined by the second effect. Okay, that brings us to the close for our look into the demand data. It is, the structure, this income side, and the fact that we take the regional income and create these expenditure categories really does sort of drive our look at it. Then, of course, we, for our purposes in this online version of the course, as far as we go, will sort of be glossing past everything and getting to those price elasticities, and we will do our any analysis of a private household demand effect using the income and price elasticity calculations that are written in there. So we have a decomposable demand equation, and of course if we were working on the government demands or interested in tracking those, we have the normal CES version there. So we're at that part where we close out the third presentation. I'll invite you to take the quiz and be in touch if you need to. and then be ready for our last, where we do some simulation and get a little practical experience in the model.